I was born in Niagara Falls, New York, February 16th, 1953. My father, chemical engineer. My mother was a bookkeeper for medical offices and other things, and had a wonderful childhood. My grandfather was the superintendent for Empire Concrete and was part of one of the largest concrete pours in the world, which was the Niagara Hydroelectric Project. So I grew up, and I've been told my first word was aggregate because of, and I love concrete. I still, to this day, absolutely love concrete. But I grew up, I've always wanted to draw. It's and paint. It's just what I've always wanted to do. And I continued to do that and enrolled in art classes and went to, after I finished high school, I went to the Harris School of Art in Nashville, Tennessee. Isaac Harris was 88 years old, I think, at that point. And he was a friend of Rockwell's, and he and Rockwell had gone to school together at the Art Students League at the turn of the century. So he was getting pretty old in the early 70s. So I went from there back to Mobile, where I started doing commercial art and other things to make money, and moved out on my own. And then decided I was going to move to Fairhope because I met Cleveland Woodward. Now, Cleveland Woodward was one of the finest maritime painters and biblical artists in the country and in the world. And he has biblical paintings all over and worked for all the major companies. And at the time I met him, I was in my early 20s and he was about 75. And a great lion of a man. And I had just thought, this guy hung the moon. So I moved to Fairhope to just sit at his feet. I was doing jobs for ad agencies in Mobile and a few other paintings and such, but I was scraping along and doing all right. And I was asked to join a coffee club. Now, the coffee club Mr. Woodward had when he lived in Truro. And when he came to Fairhope, he set up a coffee club. We all rotated from our houses. Every week we would meet at some of the houses. And that's where I cut my teeth on the most incredible people. I was the youngest person in there by about 40 to 50 years. And for 7 years, I just sat at the feet of these gentlemen. We had the retired dean of Tulane's Law School. We had authors. We had architects. We had writers. We had remarkable people. So I just listened. And I consider that my higher education was just listening to all of this incredible experience and the stories of these people. During then, I've gotten interesting commissions. I'm the only living artist, I've been told, in the Air and Space Museum. I have several paintings in the Naval Academy. I've gotten to work with phenomenal people. I was Historian General of the Naval Order of the United States for 5 years and helped get a statue-built monument on the beach at D-Day for the 1,682 sailors that were lost at that point. It has been an interesting journey. It's still an interesting journey. A long way to go. Mobile Bay has one of the most interesting histories of any body of water in the United States, or the world for that matter. Just a few decades after Columbus discovered the New World, Vasco Pineda came up Mobile Bay around 1520. And he had a caravel, which means he was able to guide himself into the bay, follow the deep water channel, heaving what's called the lead line, so he could stay in water deep enough because there were lots and lots of sandbars in Mobile Bay at that point. I did a painting that is of the Spanish coming for the first time close enough to have visual contact with both the shore and them, with the people on board. And Pineda was, unlike a lot of Spanish explorers, he was a very benign explorer. He brought trinkets and gifts and things to be able to interact with the people. The problem was, one of the things they brought that interacted with the people was smallpox, which the Europeans largely recovered from when they got it, but for the Native Americans over the years, they had absolutely no immunities whatsoever. And it is predicted that 95% of Native American cultures died of smallpox and these other diseases that the Europeans brought in. When my ancestors landed at Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower, had the local Indians been 20 times as many as they were before, I don't think they'd allowed the Pilgrims to land. But their population had been so decimated that they allowed the Pilgrims to come in. So it was much the same thing here. These people were curious, but we left a terrible decimation of their culture when the Spanish left. But the Spanish came in and had some settlements. Then DeSoto came here about 20 years later. And DeSoto, of course, came in at Florida and just cut a swath of destruction up through Florida into the Carolinas and then back down. And then north of here, he was met because the reputation of his army as being so destructive had gotten well ahead of his army. So a chieftain by the name of Tuscaloosa set up, brought a huge mass of his natives together, about 7,000 or so of them, to meet DeSoto's heavy armor and European steel. And they clashed at the Battle of Mobila, which was north of Mobile, probably about 40 miles. And that was a legendary battle. But Tuscaloosa did not defeat the Spanish, but he broke them as a fighting force. And DeSoto's original 600 men dwindled down to about 20. And he died as they were pushing across the Mississippi River. And only a few of his men survived. And that put the Spanish off coming here for a while. And then later on, the French came in and established a series of Fort Louis north of Mobile. And that was a kind of a pestilential swamp, and they had problems with that. So in about 1711, they moved down to the site of the present Mobile, and they named Mobile after Mobila, this legendary battle that they had heard about that had taken place in that area. So that's how Mobile was named, was for the village of Mobila and where the battle was took place. Then the French were here for a number of years, and then the British came in, and then the Americans came in. And so that evolved up with all of the different cultural descendants and things that were in Mobile and the whole area around here was a polyglot. There was an awful lot of intermarriage with the natives in the area. It was mostly an agrarian culture. And then later Mobile set up as a deep water port because the river, Mobile River, goes by, and then you have a nice channel that goes out into the Gulf of Mexico. And then about in the 1830s and 1840s, to prevent the Spanish, French, or British from ever invading, which there was a danger of that, as we found out in the War of 1812, Fort Morgan was built because it was by the deep water access on the eastern side of Mobile Bay at the mouth. And then they built Fort Gaines on the western side, and that is a much smaller fort because the channel there is not as deep as the deep water channel, but it would, if somebody tried to flank in their gunboats or such, they could go by Fort Gaines, but it was big enough to stop that. Fort Morgan is the gigantic fort that's about 600 feet across and extremely well fortified. And the Confederates took over this federal fort when the Civil War was declared. And so they then manned that with a huge garrison down there to keep out the Federals. Admiral Farragut, who was born in the South but was in the Northern Navy and loyal to the North, Lincoln liked him and put him in charge of the Gulf Coast blockading squadron. And the first thing that Farragut did was went and took the city of New Orleans. People don't realize that there was a large tendency in Britain to side with the Confederacy because they wanted the cotton for their mills. And the French also, in fact, the the Southern cotton supplied a tremendous number of mills all through Europe, as well as America and the Northeast. But Farragut, once he took New Orleans, started to take over the Mississippi River, and he wanted to come back after he took New Orleans to take Mobile, which he felt was incredibly important to take Mobile. It was one of the last deep water ports on the Gulf. So then, but he was told he was to go up to take Vicksburg, which he took in July of 1863. Then he set his sights on taking Mobile. And he came back out, and by August of 1864, he had amassed the fleet that he needed to attack and take Mobile Bay. But the Confederates were ready for him. But on the morning of August 5th, 1864, he made his attack on Fort Morgan and came up with his ironclads and his vessels and ran into a lot of problems. The Tecumseh, one of the giant Union ironclads, hit one of the mines or torpedoes that were in the bay and sank in very short order, taking 91 men to their deaths. And it's still there, entombed just off the fort. But Farragut ran into a problem, and he decided he had to go through the torpedo field, which was really a minefield. And when somebody objected to that, he said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," which has come down to us. But that was uttered at about 7:45 a.m., August 5th, 1864. And of course, Farragut did take Mobile, and then the Federals came in and came up the eastern shore, and there was a large battle at Blakely. They couldn't take Mobile from the western side, so they took it from the eastern side, near Spanish Fort. But Blakely was the last large land battle fought in the Civil War, which was 20,000 Union troops attacking about 5,000 Confederate troops. Then Mobile fell to the Union. The Union went over into Mobile and occupied Mobile. Now, Mardi Gras had never really been celebrated, but that's when Mardi Gras really took off, because people could dress up in costumes and taunt their aggressors. And so you had people who and that, if you can believe, masks and robes used to taunt troops, it's about the same time the Ku Klux Klan was getting started after the Civil War. And so that's one of the reasons Mobile developed in that manner. The development of the Eastern Shore is really rather interesting. There was no bayway until the 1920s, the late 1920s. So the only access to the Eastern Shore was by boat, steamer. And the steamers went out of Mobile. And Mobile also had GM&O Railroad, which was the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad. So after the Civil War, GM&O really developed the whole railroad network, and Mobile was a hub with a terminal over there. And then the bay boats, which were right next to the terminal, would come to the Eastern Shore. And there were boat docks in Daphne and Battles Wharf, and then the Grand Hotel, for example. There was also Zundel's landing in other places. But there was no landing in Fairhope because there was no Fairhope. Fairhope was just settled by people. A lot of them were African Americans. There was a tremendous number of landowners on the Eastern Shore that were African American, white and African American. And some of them lived in the Fairhope area, but they didn't call it Fairhope area. There was Tatumville and several other names of several of the sort of small communities that were there. In 1879, a gentleman by the name of Henry George, a brilliant human being, wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. And it talked about how can there be so much progress and yet so much poverty at the same time. And he said it came down to land ownership. To this day in England, the royal family and the crown owns somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of the land in England. And you have a lease in England that is about a 100-year lease when you lease something. But the problem with those leases is they run down year by year, and you can't renew them. So when you get closer to the end of your lease, your property taxes are going to jump. So you can't get as much money for your improvements on your property. So all of that boils down. Henry George said that's unfair because you're a prisoner of wealthy people who own large blocks of land. So we said what you do is you lease land to people, and then you allow them to build and not be punished economically for the improvements they build. What you're hoping is the aggregate amount of improvements that people build will drive up the value of the improvements, but you hold the land cost down because you're not trying to profit from the land cost. But this really caught on, but to change it nationally or internationally was going to be a movement that was going to be very difficult. So the Des Moines, Iowa Single Tax Club, headed by a gentleman by the name of E.B. Gaston, decided that they were going to form their own utopian community. So they sent out teams of people. They met in January of 1894 in Des Moines, and they had worked up a constitution. And the Constitution was approved unanimously by all the single taxers that were there. Then they approved creating a town or charter, and that was approved. And then somebody in the back said, well, where is this town? They said, well, we haven't chosen it yet, but we'll be looking for the sites. And that's when a gentleman by the name of Alf Wooster spoke up and said, I think this has a fair hope of success. And they said, that's catchy, let's call the town Fairhope. So they started to send out teams of people. They were largely looking in the South because the South was still ravaged by the Civil War, and economically land was inexpensive. And what they wanted to do was find a large block of land that they could buy inexpensively and then develop the value on it using the single tax system. So George Belanger and Mr. Mann came to this area and wrote back saying, we found the perfect spot to build Fairhope. There's a spring, and there's still a spring. And they said, we have water, we have high bluffs and sandy banks, the land seems to be good, so I think this is where we should build our utopia. So they hands down approved the site and decided to have what's called the Roundup on November 15th, 1895. You couldn't get to Fairhope. There was no pier in Fairhope. So they had to arrive in Battles Wharf by steamer. Then, and some of the people had come down from Ohio and other places in the north in Conestoga wagons to be here. And they rounded up here on November 15th, 1895, and started their experiment, which they called Fairhope. And it's been, I would say, an overwhelming success. Now, what the Fairhopians did from the beginning is they gave women equal rights from the get-go, voting rights and organizational status within the Single Tax Corporation. They also, E.B. very much was troubled. He wanted to give African Americans equal rights in the single tax, but he couldn't do it because they would have been burned out. The rednecks are always with us. And there are a lot of people that felt very, very strongly about that. And so when they came to Nancy Lewis, E.B. paid her far more than her house was worth and property was worth to buy it from her. And with that, she was able to buy, I think, 30 acres and be able to build another house on there. And so that's why Fairhope sort of formed the way it did. As of today, we have over 4,500 acres of land. We have 3,500 lessees, and we are a thriving community. What I've always called the Klan trial, which was the Michael Donald civil trial. The story behind that was Michael Donald was a young man going to college, saving, working at the Mobile Press Register. And his friend, Willie Shaw, told me this. Willie is a good friend who has worked for the city of Fairhope and a fine Mason. But Willie was working at the Press Register with a group of the African Americans that were there. And on that evening, that Michael Donald was killed, Willie's car was full, and he told Michael to wait there because he knew what could possibly happen. He said, "You wait there, I'll be back." And so he hurried to drop off several people so he could come back and get Michael, but when he got back there, he was gone. What had happened in the intervening time was the Klan, led by Benny Jack Hayes and his son and Tiger Knowles and one other person, were looking for a nigger to kill. A white woman had married a black man, totally unrelated to any of this, but they were looking for revenge. How dare a woman marry a black man? And they found Michael Donald, and they ostensibly asked him directions. Well, how do I get there? And then they pulled a gun on him and got him into the car. They took him to Spanish Fort and virtually beat him to death, shoved him in the trunk, and then they took him back over to Mobile in front of a small apartment building that Benny Jack Hayes owned and hung him from a tree. And Benny Jack Hayes was quoted as saying, "Ain't that a beautiful sight?" when he saw this. And my friend Bob Eddy, who is probably the single best investigator this state's ever produced, very dear friend, explained the whole system. Because the Mobile Police Department did not want to have this be a racist or Klan-based incident. And Bob Eddy was the one that said, "You have got to, this is a Klan-based." And so they tried it as a Klan-based. The Klan at that point, the Mobile chapter, or whatever the hell it is, was run by Benny Jack Hayes. Now, Benny Jack Hayes was an arsonist. He was a con man. He ran the Klan. Now, the first time the inner workings of the Klan came out that I know of were at this trial. And they had, one of the people they put on the scale was somebody who suffered severely from Down syndrome. And he was taken into the Klan for the purpose of being a whipping boy. Now, they brought the fellow in, and they had all of these rituals and things they would make up, and they're absolutely absurd. But it was deliberate because the Down syndrome young man couldn't remember all these things. And when he would break these silly things they were making up, the rules, they would say, "I'm sorry, we've got to whip you." And they would literally take a whip, and they would take turns whipping. And then when it was over, they'd say, "We'll put a little salve on this, and we'll give you a Coca-Cola, and then try not to do it next time." And they deliberately would make him do it so they could whip him. So we're talking about some pretty low human beings here. But Benny Jack Hayes was illiterate. At one point, one of the prosecutors was grilling him about his lying, which he did often. And he went through 13 different depositions taken by other people that proved he was lying. And the last one before they got to his deposition was, he said, "Well, this is your daughter who said this about you." And he said, "Even she lies sometimes." And he said, "But sir, here's your deposition. Would you please read what you said in your deposition for us?" And he said, "My doctor says I can't read today." And somebody near me said, "Or any other day," because this is just the kind of scum that Benny Jack Hayes was. These Klans people are just filled with hatred for somebody who wasn't like them. And Fairhope suffered from that in the Fairhope was a sundown town, if you know what that means, up into a lot of the 1950s. And that means that if you were black, you were to be out of town by sundown. It was Arthur Manick, God bless him, who had the grocery store in downtown Fairhope, which is across from where Page and Pallet is now at that time. And he was the first to hire African Americans in his store. And he was chastised by a lot of people. And my mother-in-law had someone that came in to do ironing so she could work in an art shop. And she just paid the person who did the African American lady the same that she got for working at the shop, because she'd much rather work in the shop than iron. She paid her what turned out to be a dime more than the people in Point Clear were paying their maids. And so she got riled. These people would come in and say, "How dare you pay more? Because then I'll have to pay Beulah or whomever more money." And she said, "I don't care. This is what I make there, and that's what I'm going to give her on there." So you had that type of mindset, elitism, racist. It's just, and it continues today and still. It's something that we all have to work on. Very difficult topic is civil rights and the evolution of civil rights in this entire region. The South, after it was defeated, the number one income source for the state prior to the Civil War was the taxation on the ownership of slaves. It was $3 million a year, which was the largest income the state received, single income the state received. Very important. So after you abolished slavery, there was no income. Very little. And the South was impoverished. And instead of being able to develop equal rights through a federal system, that gave way to political machinations where you had evolved to sharecropping. So what you did then is you allowed blacks and poor whites to have shacks and a piece of ground where then the owner of the land would, it's the exact opposite of single tax, would then take a percentage of the crop that was done. And you were never able to get ahead. And that's just the way the landowners wanted it to be. So you had a huge segregation and class distinction in those days. And of course, if blacks got out of line, they were treated as subhumans. And when they would gather together or do anything to try to move forward, there would be lynchings and killings and others. And that's when the Klan was very open and excessive in this, well, it was all over the South. And of course, that comes up into the 20th century. Then up into the 20s, you had tens of thousands of Klansmen descending on Washington for gigantic marches. And you even had a candidate, presidential candidate, that got pretty close at that point in time. But the South was going to hold firm on its segregation. And so that works us up into the 60s with Wallace. I recently did a painting of the 4 little girls that were killed in the bombing in 1963 in the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I had the honor of being able to go into the basement to the exact spot where this happened and work with Carolyn Mall McKinstry, who wrote the book While the World Watched. She was the last one to pass through to say hi to her friends before she went upstairs and the bomb went off. So I replicated the entire scene. Carolyn came in, I worked with several of the families of the girls, and produced a painting I'm very proud of, called Carolyn's Memory. So with that, but also back in the 80s and 90s, I worked for NBC for 6 years covering federal court as an artist. And one of the trials I covered was the Michael Donald civil trial. Now, Michael Donald was the last African American lynched in the United States. I hope to God he's the last one. And of course, the civil trial was suing the Klan, the Michael Donald family, and the Southern Poverty Law Center handled the case. It was the making of the Southern Poverty Law Center for the Morris Dees, was in the civil trial saying that the Klan was responsible because they encouraged their members to do a lot of these heinous acts. And so the trial was one Klansman after another, including Robert Shelton, who was then the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. And of course, he sat on the stand and he talked about, we're Boy Scouts, we don't tell people to do all these mayhem things. And of course they did. The most poignant part of the entire trial was I was sitting as close to Mrs. Donald, the mother of Michael Donald, who was a fine young man, as close as I am to you. And she sat there in honor of her son. And she sat every day with her head held high and her sitting proudly for her son. And at times I'd look at her and tears would be just streaming down her face, but she never broke. She didn't sob. She didn't make a scene. She was there to represent the honor of her son. Tiger Knowles, who was one of the people that beat her son to death and then hung him from a tree, testified day after day after day, just talking about all the things that he did, just as cold as he could be. But on his last day of testimony, and there was no way to tell he was even cognizant that Mrs. Donald was in the room. But on his last day of testimony, he stopped in mid-testimony and he looked at her and he said, "Ma'am, I only hope that you can forgive me for what I've done." And without a second's hesitation, she said, "Young man, I already have." And there was not a dry eye in the courtroom, including mine. Very, very powerful. If there's a higher symbol of Christian forgiveness than that, I don't think it exists. So that was the creation. At that trial, the Ku Klux Klan was made. In fact, Mrs. Donald ended up owning the Ku Klux Klan assets and headquarters in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Hate groups at that point in time legally were made responsible for the actions of their members, which is a huge lawsuit threshold that was crossed at that time. That really began the change. And what Southern Poverty Law Center has been able to do is track Nazis and neo-Nazis and skinheads and all of those organizations so they can monitor what they're saying and telling their people they can or can't do. And it's a very, very positive tool in trying to end people who are trying to gather to be able to do terrible things to each other. But right now, with what you're seeing with Black Lives Matter and all of these terrible things that are going on now, it's a faction of America that would love to return us to those times. And we have to fight them because we're better than that, and we need to be better than that. And we need to move forward. As Dr. Seuss said, people are people no matter how small, and we've got to hold on to the fact that we're all equal under the law and by rights with each other.